And on today's show, estate planning below the unified credit. Part 2 of this week's series on marketing to middle America with top of the table and Form 400, Jim Silbernagel. Hi everyone, I'm Steve Savant, syndicated financial columnist and contributing author to Backroom Technician and Innsmark. Let's get down to business. Well, welcome to day 2 of our show, Jim.
Hey, thanks for having me back.
I am, and I'm happy to have you here because not only are you a certified financial planner, you're a Form 400 producer, a top of the table, lifetime MDRT, but you're from a little town in Wisconsin called?
Kewaskum.
And Kewaskum is how many people live in that place?
About 4,000, depending on what time of day.
And and most of your clients come from only a 10 to 15?
A good portion of them, yes.
Mile radius, right?
Yeah.
I mean, to me, this is fabulous because most of our advisors today are saying, Steve, I just want to up my game. I want to go to the next level. I'm really not sure how to do it. Jim, you really have conquered what I call the middle America mentality because you really don't have what I would call monster size affluent clients. You have some big, but generally your clients are middle America. Now, when we talk about today's show, especially, we're talking about everything below the unified credit. I think the total credit now, married couple, is 10.5, something like that. It's north of that number. I mean, so we're not even talking about estate taxes generally. Now, by the way, a little side note though, I noticed that most state taxes are not in the same unified credit range as the federal. So you may not have estate taxes, but you may very well have state taxes.
And that's huge. That's a huge part of our discussion in Wisconsin. You know, they brought back state inheritance tax temporarily during the temporary rule on estates over $675,000. Our neighbors, Minnesota, just recently passed $1 million exemption, and my understanding is that it doesn't follow the guidelines where you just fill out a form with the feds and that counts. You still have to do credit shelter planning, is what it was explained to me by an advisor in Minnesota. So estate taxes are an issue that even though most of my clients don't even fit the old rules at $600,000, you know, that's $1.2 million with husband and wife, a lot of our clients underneath that, I still spend a lot of time discussing that estate tax because it is one of the most biggest impacts on a family, and most of them don't realize what the rates are, what the history is of it. So spending a little time talking about that, I think, is important. I
think this is an area for advisors. This is a kind of a discussion to bring back onto the table. You need to look at your state that you're doing business in and look at those numbers because I think you'll be surprised. Like I've been many times, I don't have a federal estate problem, but I do have a state problem where I'm domiciled. So that's a whole new area to pick up. And Jim, you do this really well, and this is why we're bringing this to the attention of our audience today. This is an area where we need to pick up. We talk about avoiding probate. I mean, it's, you know, of course we do. We're using insurance products. But you kind of take an attack on this because you don't want any of this, any assets of your clients going through that meat grinder, and it can be problematic.
Oh, absolutely. And it's just the headaches and hassle. It's bad enough dealing with the loss of a loved one. And my experience has been when clients are involved, the family members are involved in that process, it's a very stressful process that a lot of them would choose to avoid. And I tell my clients it's all about keeping the family in control and the people you care about. And the thing is, even with the estate planning that we talk about, whether it's the estate taxes, whether it's Title 19 provisions in a power of attorney or the healthcare power of attorney or HIPAA laws, the thing I want to impress upon them, even though they may not have an estate tax problem today, it may never, is that it's planning, not planned. You know, too many clients think, oh, check that off the box, we're done. And, you know, my business partner always talks about when the dust on the documents is thicker than the documents, it might be time to look at it again, you know. So it's something that we can talk about on a regular basis. It gives you purpose of what you're doing. And again, it helps establish that trusting relationship with the client.
I've noticed a lot of people think, well, I went to my attorney, I did my will, I put a trust together, and now I should be golden. But you have found many times this is just not true.
Right, and you know what? And to my brethren that are attorneys, I think they're more transactional. We're more relationship, and some of the things that we know about our clients, the attorneys don't necessarily know. And I find by collaborating with them, it's always a better result. And we've actually worked out a system with a couple different attorneys where we do the legwork, they do the legal work. It helps create some efficiencies and costs, and our clients appreciate that. But in working closely with the attorneys, you make sure there's no stones unturned. And probably one of the biggest balls that gets dropped when it comes to estate planning is the funding issues. And attorneys don't have access to the form software that we have. I mean, I can print up the beneficiary forms for 90% of the companies out there out of my office. So imagine the efficiencies I can help the attorney with by just filling out the forms for making sure everything's formatted to go through that trust.
Do you see that kind of extra value added attracts attorneys to your practice?
Unfortunately, in our area, our attorneys are a little bit they're not in that same mode that we are. They're more in the transactional and the fees that they're generating from it. But the attorneys that we have worked with, it's worked with extremely well, and they're very appreciative of the collaboration.
We come back from the break. We're going to talk more about estate planning below the unified credit with Jim. We'll be right back. Back in the day, life insurance professionals were called field underwriters. Then, carriers trained their field force in the basics of life insurance underwriting. Today, the insurance industry doesn't educate the agent population as they once did. But now you can have the Informed Risk Guide at your fingertips so you can illustrate a reasonable rate class for your life insurance prospects. Just request your copy of the Informed Risk Guide at downtobusiness.ashbrokerage.com. It's free from Ash Brokerage, the practice enhancement company. Well, welcome back to our second segment. Jim, let's talk about some of the powers of attorney. And before I get too deep into that, I notice you are to spendthrift creditor protection. I never think of that because in a bigger city, I never hear about, well, where's the thrift? Where's these smaller bank-like or credit unions?
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that from your perspective.
Well, spendthrift, what we're referring to there is protecting heirs from their creditors. And to give you an example, I had a client who came to me when she was diagnosed with cancer, and she was concerned about one of her kids because she thought that they had real serious financial issues. And she said, well, does my trust protect against that? I said, yeah, it does. And she says, well, can you help me with it because I suspect my daughter has problems. She hasn't told any of us. And I said, well, what makes you suspect that? Well, when she announced she had cancer, unfortunately, this child came to her and said, can I get the inheritance a little early, Mom? Well, by us working through that, that child was able to go through bankruptcy, and Mom got her wish of making sure that her money benefited her kids, not her kids' creditors. Mm-hmm. So that's a key issue in the estate planning. Even though we don't run across it that often, it does affect a lot of families, and especially in families that are a more modest means, that's a more important thing to have. Now,
in the first segment, we talked about, hey, you still may be subject to state taxes and transfer at death. But you also are into talking about healthcare directives. Now, talk a little bit about this because nobody that I know wants to talk about this. I have to say, even when I went through this, the Savant did not want to talk about it.
Okay.
So I had to get past it myself, because we're talking about giving somebody else the power to pull the plug, basically.
Yeah. Well, and you know what? What you just shared is a little bit of a misconception about it because the old living will, that's all it was pulling the plug. But this document goes into whether or not to stay in a nursing home, be transferred, where you're getting your health care. There's a whole myriad of issues. And it's all about keeping the family in control. And this is where the family meetings are good because this gives me a chance to poke Mom and Dad a little bit and say, hey, have you talked to your kids about this yet? Because I warned them. I said, your kids are going to make sure you do your homework. And that is have this family meeting, have a discussion of how you feel, because there is nothing worse than having someone in that position, and now you have one of the kids coming in with no direction. And if they have multiple kids, they all have multiple ideas of what they think. And it can literally tear a family apart by not having that communication. It's incredible.
Do you see a lot of difference, because you're in so many states in your practice? Wisconsin is a community property state,
yes.
But you have states that are not community property.
Right.
First of all, are there unique obstacles and challenges in community property, and how about specifically to Wisconsin?
Well, Wisconsin's got a unique, we call ourselves marital property. So what's real interesting is when you read national articles about community property states, Wisconsin a lot of times is omitted because we decided to be unique and call it marital, but we are a community property state. So what's really key, especially when I'm working in other states, I'm not an expert of every state's rules. I try to get familiar with it, but what I try to do is if I'm going to connect with somebody, in another state, I'm going to make sure we find an attorney that understands estate planning, and then also find a CPA. Sometimes our office can help with that, or try to work with a local CPA to deal with the same issues, because they're kind of universal. It's just a matter of finding the nuances. Like, for example, in Florida, they have tenancy in the entirety. That allows for some creditor protection between spouses. So knowing those things can make you a valuable resource for your clients.
Well, when you're talking about documentation and so forth, I noticed that in part of your discussions, you use this phrase backup wills. I'm thinking like, well, isn't my will good enough? Is the one I have okay? Talk about backup wills.
Well, basically, the will kind of cleans the slate, lets everybody know that the estate plan that they did, the trust, is the main document. But there is one thing that can slip through probate. And we spend a lot of time making sure these trusts are funded, everything's formatted to flow through the trust, because we want the benefits of the trust, including those creditor protection issues. But the backup will, if there's a lawsuit at death, okay, that's all handled by the estate, and the backup will says, okay, put it in my trust for distribution. And the reason we want to do that, it helps maintain some privacy. But again, a lot of times people have IRA beneficiaries that go right to the kids directly, and there's tax issues. You got to talk to your advisor about that. But the having that creditor protection is huge, especially when you see, you know, the divorce rate in this country. You see the mortgage foreclosure rate. You know, and mom and dad worked a long time to have those assets, so making sure those are always protected. We want everything to flow together, so that's what that backup will does.
I noticed also that you use an IRA subtrust. Now, I thought, well, I have my IRA. I've already declared my beneficiaries. Why do I need a subtrust?
Well, there's a lot of debate among the IRA planners out there as to what attack might come next. And as we know, our federal government has a little bit of a deficit and spending problem. In IRAs, there's a ton of money in there, with baby boomers being the first generation to spend their all working career with 401ks and IRAs being part of their saving for retirement, now a majority of it. We see some pretty large sums. And if beneficiaries are forced into a lump sum distribution, that's pretty huge. Now, a lot of people don't realize when you name the kids as beneficiaries, the creditor protection that we have in retirement accounts goes away. That only counts for spouses and the participants. So to maintain that creditor protection, we want it to go through the trust. Well, trust can be a little bit tricky because if you have multiple beneficiaries and you put down, you know, $10 to St. Mary's of the Poor, that leaves a door open for the IRS to say that trust wasn't solely for the benefit of a natural person and could require a lump sum. Or better case scenario, but still kind of challenging, if you had your parents as a potential beneficiary, even though everybody else is gone, if I got a parent around, they can still get it. Well, there's a lot around the country that'll say we have to take the oldest possible beneficiary and use their life expectancy for the stretch. So I want to make sure we have the options, that each individual beneficiary can pick the method that's best for them, and that we have those creditor protections in what might be the biggest asset of the parents.
Wow, an IRA subtrust.
Yes.
Wow. Well, that's all the time we have for today's show. Remember, before moving forward with any of the ideas on our show, always consult your tax advisor, legal counsel, or your broker-dealer compliance officer. Missed an episode? Just hop out to our site, downtobusiness.ashbrokerage.com. And remember, you could be wiser as an Ash Brokerage advisor. I'm Steve Savant. We'll see you tomorrow.